Hello and welcome back. This is the week 3 lecture. So today we continue our work with narratives. I introduced this style of writing, this method of development last week, and we covered some of the key terms and concepts, most of which you guys probably already knew, at least to some extent. You probably learned a lot of those basic elements of narrative back in high school and some previous class. So today we're going to add to our store of knowledge. We're going to continue to learn some important concepts related to narrative, but we might be entering some more uncharted territory this week. I want to introduce a practice or a sort of a technique that's common in English classes. It's common in the study of literature, and it's called close reading. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. We're really only going to do it during this week because we're going to sort of move on and cover some new material next week. And then pretty soon we're going to leave narrative behind and move on to our next writing style. But close reading can be fun if you sort of get into the right spirit. So I'll talk more about close reading today. I'll introduce a few new terms, but I actually want to start with something else. Before we jump back into narrative, I want to talk about the writing process a little bit. I've posted information about the writing process in both the week 1 and the week 2 modules, but I don't think I've really talked very much about it in lecture. If I have, I'm sorry, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, but I don't think we've really gotten into this. I did post that Simpsons video clip that was entitled The Writing Process. I hope some of you watched that. It's also available here in week 3. It's a funny video, and it's mostly there for entertainment, but it does teach us a valuable lesson. If you watch that video and you see Lisa struggling to write her book, you might notice some similarities between what she's going through and what maybe you've gone through with some of your previous writing assignments. So the whole idea with that video is that Lisa is not following the steps of the writing process. And as a result, she is struggling, she's having a tough time completing her work. And then meanwhile, we see Homer and everybody else sort of working together in a more collaborative way, and they seem to be following a lot more of our writing process steps. So they have success while she struggles. So we're supposed to notice that contrast. So I've included sort of the entire writing process back in earlier weeks. I've kind of listed all the major phases. There are kind of 3 basic phases or sections when we're talking about the writing process, and each phase has individual steps within it. So typically we talk about pre-writing, we talk about drafting, and then we talk about post-writing. Those are the 3 major phases of the writing process. I'm sure a lot of you have learned about these phases or these different steps before. You're probably familiar with the basic idea of a writing process, but I want to go over it today because so many students skip a lot of these steps. And I understand why. There are a lot of steps. There are a lot of things to do. And sometimes we think that we're just too short on time, or maybe we don't think we need to follow all of these steps. Maybe we're a little bit overconfident at times, or maybe we just don't want to be bothered with all of this stuff. We just want to get to the actual writing. But if you skip steps, especially early on, you're going to make the overall writing experience more difficult for yourself at a later point. So today, I really just want to focus on pre-writing. We'll talk more about drafting and post-writing later. But I want us to think about pre-writing today because pretty soon we're going to get started on Essay 1, which is, of course, our own narratives. So we're not quite there yet, but in a couple of weeks, we're going to be working on our essays. So we need to be comfortable with basic pre-writing strategies to help us get started. So as you might be able to tell just by looking at the prefix, Pre-writing simply means all of the stuff you do before you actually start writing. So this sounds kind of obvious, and it might sound a little Mickey Mouse to some of us. We might not think that it's necessary for us. That's also what Lisa thinks in the Simpsons video. She thinks that she can just sit down in front of a blank computer screen and basically hammer out her paper or book, whatever. It could be any writing assignment. She thinks that she can just hammer it out in a few hours. No big deal. She doesn't have a plan. She doesn't have any ideas already written down. She just tries to sit down and get started all at once. And as you can see, if you watch the video, it doesn't work out very well for her. So the first part of pre-writing is just basic idea generation. This is just a term for all of the things you do to get some ideas flowing, to get some ideas down on paper. So most of the idea generation stuff that we do is very informal. It might be kind of rough, it might be a little messy. You're never going to show it typically to other people. You won't typically have to show it to me. Idea generation is strictly for you. It is there to help the writer get started. So you guys have probably been introduced to some of these basic idea generation strategies in the past. So we can talk about brainstorming, which really just means thinking. You can do that anywhere at any time, but you do need to put some thought into any writing assignment that you might have. You need to think about your purpose. You need to think about what you want to accomplish. You need to think about the assignment instructions. That's one of the first things you need to do when you're getting started on a major essay. Read my instructions. They are clear, they are detailed, and I'm pretty much telling you exactly what I want you to do. So read the instructions, think about how you want to meet my requirements, and that's step one. You can do some of this brainstorming while you're driving, while you're in the shower, while you're grocery shopping, whenever some thoughts pop into your mind. But then you need to start getting some of those thoughts written down. You need to get them recorded, either in a Word doc or somehow electronically, or you could also just write by hand. So a method that I still use is free writing. You guys might have heard of this. A free write, not to be confused with pre-write. Free writing is a type of idea generation strategy that we do during the pre-writing stage, but they're not the exact same thing. A free write is pretty much what it sounds like. You sit down and you write about your topic, about whatever you need to do for the assignment. You just start writing about it without stopping and without worrying about grammar, spelling, without worrying about your penmanship or whether or not you're writing in complete sentences. None of that stuff matters with the free write. Of course, it all matters later when you're actually turning your work in, but with the free write, the whole idea, the whole goal is just to get ideas on paper. So typically I'll write for about 10 to 15 minutes nonstop. And I'll just see what I come up with. A lot of what I write down might not be particularly valuable. I might not end up using everything that I've put on paper, but that's okay. Even if you only end up using 25% of those ideas, 20% of those thoughts or observations that you jotted down, that's still a win. That's still helping you. Now you have some material that you can work with. And even the stuff that you don't end up keeping, just the process of thinking about it, writing it down, and even that process of elimination. saying, oh, I actually don't want to get into that, or I'm not really going to pursue that idea, that still helps because you're narrowing down your focus and you're getting rid of some stuff that maybe you were considering, but now you've decided, no, I'm going to go in a different direction. That's still a good thing to do. So I'm a big fan of the free write. You can also do clustering. I'm not sure if you guys have ever done this. It's another idea generation strategy. You start with an idea, a general idea or an observation or a belief, whatever, and you put it in a circle. You can do this, in a Word doc or by hand on a separate sheet of paper, and then you draw little connecting lines to other related ideas. So you start with a basic central concept, and then you start coming up with other related ideas based on that central concept. And by drawing little lines, connecting them all to the center, what you're doing is creating a network. You're creating sort of this larger structure that might help you to get started. We also recommend that students use what are often called sort of the 5 journalist questions. These are often questions that reporters are trying to answer in their reporting, but we can also use these. These are especially helpful when it comes to narratives. So let me run through these. What happened? Okay, that's number 1. What happened? What's the major event? What's the major thing that we're talking about? Who was involved? That's number 2. This helps you to start thinking about characters. Okay, who was involved in this event? Who are the important people in my narrative? When did it happen? That's the 3rd question. So now we're thinking a little bit about physical location. We're thinking about time with when did it happen. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. When did it happen might help us to think about historical time period. It might help us think about temporal setting. If you remember last week, I said there are 2 levels of setting. There is physical location, there's the place where things happen, and then there's also time, the time period in which things happen. Is it present, past, maybe future? So we can start thinking about time when we think about when did this major event happen. Then we can ask, where did it happen? That's the next one. That helps us think about physical location. The next one is, why did it happen? So now we're maybe thinking about cause and effect. We're thinking about the factors that led to the event. So this will give us a better understanding of the event. And then finally, how did it happen? So what were the actual, what actions took place? What steps were taken? What was the procedure? What was the process behind the action? So you might not be able to answer every single one of those questions, but if you run through them and if you answer the ones that you are able to answer, you'll just have some ideas. You'll have some ideas, you might have some names, some place locations, and you can work with all of that as you move along. So idea generation, again, it's informal. It can sort of be fun. I think it's kind of fun because it's just you. You don't really have to follow a lot of rules, and you don't typically have to turn any of this idea generation stuff in. So it's designed to be strictly for you. And you can do it any way that works for you. But you don't have to be isolated and alone when you're generating ideas. You can also talk to people, and sometimes that can be helpful. Not always, it depends on the writing assignment. But if you're writing about something that people in your life might know about, maybe you have family or friends that are knowledgeable about this topic or about this event or about this narrative that you're trying to get started on, then by all means, talk to people. This can be a little bit collaborative. Sometimes talking to others might help you get ideas moving in your own brain. But like I mentioned earlier, just in general, when you're getting started with pre-writing, think a little bit about your purpose. And that's usually laid out pretty clearly in my instructions for the assignment. assignment. So you might want to, read the instructions and then just kind of clarify to yourself, what is it that you are trying to accomplish? What do you want to do here with this assignment? Always have your purpose in mind. Always think a little bit about audience as well. Think a little bit about what your audience expects, what your audience wants. And of course, you know that the most important member of your audience is going to be me. But don't forget that with a lot of our writing assignments, you'll have other audience members as well. And they will typically be your classmates. Now, with the narrative, we're not going to do peer review because typically some students write about sort of sensitive issues, or not always, but sometimes some write about personal things or sort of, potentially private matters that we might not want to share with classmates. So we don't do peer review until Essay 2. But we will be doing it throughout the semester. So for some of your writing assignments, your classmates will also be audience members. And maybe family or friends. I mean, any number of people could potentially read your essay. So just think about what readers need. What do they need in order to understand and appreciate my narrative? What do readers typically want? That might be a tough question to answer, but there's a general answer that you can provide. We want to be entertained. We don't want to be bored. We don't want to be insulted. We don't want to be treated badly. So you know certain things to avoid, and you already know certain things that you would like to accomplish. You would like to hold our interest. That seems obvious, but it's good to remind yourself of that sometimes as you're getting started. The next thing to do with pre-writing is what I call sort of a rough draft of your thesis. Now, as I mentioned last week, we might not be comfortable calling our overall narrative point a thesis, because typically we associate a thesis statement with more traditional academic writing. We associate a thesis statement with an argument, oftentimes. And you might be thinking, well, in my narrative, I'm not really making an argument, I'm telling a story. And that's fine. We can also use the word theme, as I said last week. Theme and narrative point and thesis, all of those terms are pretty much interchangeable. They're all referring to the same thing. Your point, your message, your overall meaning. So even if you're not planning on directly stating it in your narrative, and you have that choice, again, narratives are creative, they're imaginative, more so than most academic writing, so you don't have to have a clear thesis statement in your narrative like you'll need to have in all of our future major essays. Narratives are a little different. Narratives are a little more personalized, so it's your choice. You don't have to state it to your audience, but it should be pretty clear to your audience after they've finished reading the narrative. And you need to be clear on it at this early stage. That's why it's a good idea to go ahead and write it down. Even if it's not going to appear in the actual narrative, you still need to write it down. Even if those exact words, don't appear later in the narrative, it's still good to have them jotted down, maybe along with your idea generation activities. You just need to make sure that you, the writer, understand and are fully comfortable with the narrative point that you're trying to communicate, that you're trying to express. And sometimes that can be as simple as just scribbling it down. You can play around with the wording. You can play around with how that sentence actually reads and how it looks. But go ahead and start working on that at this early stage, so you don't get halfway through the narrative and realize that you don't really have a point. You don't really have a larger meaning, and then you might feel a little panicked. So this is another thing to do early on before you actually start writing. I also mentioned organization, and I want to spend some time on this, and I'm actually going to end part 1 of this lecture after we talk about organizing. And then part two, we'll get back into narratives. And I'll keep both parts roughly the same length. So organization's really key at this stage of the game. And when I'm talking about organization, I'm really talking about two things. I'm talking about outlining, and I am a big believer in outlines. I love outlines. An outline is simply a blueprint or a plan for your paper. It's the thing that Lisa does not have. I mean, she has nothing. But the thing that would really benefit her the most as she sits down to start writing would be an outline. So we're always going to outline before we move on to the drafting stage with any of our major essays. So part one of organization is outlining. Part two is scheduling. And this might seem a little strange, but I recommend that all of you make a writing schedule as you're getting started on each of our major essays, beginning in a couple of weeks with the narrative. I don't know your schedules. I don't know when you guys have free time. I don't know when your other classes are. I don't know what hours you work at your jobs or what your kids are doing or whatever. Only you guys know that. So you are in a position, you're in the best position of anyone to make a schedule for yourself. So think ahead a little bit. You know what most of your weeks look like. So look ahead and block off some time and say, okay, on Thursday evening, I have some free time, so I'm going to work for a couple of hours then, and I have some free time maybe on Saturday, and then a little bit more free time next Wednesday, whatever. Just make a schedule. It can be very informal. Again, I'm never going to ask for it, but you guys should make one strictly for yourselves so you know exactly when you can work on the paper. All right, so that's pretty much it for pre-writing. The next phase, and we'll talk about it later, is drafting. That's the next phase of the writing process. And drafting simply means writing. So that's the point at which you sit down and actually start to compose your essay. But see, so many students want to start with drafting. They skip all of the pre-writing stuff. They frequently skip a lot of the post-writing stuff, all of the things you do after you have a completed draft. And a lot of students think that drafting is it. That's it. I sit down, I write the paper. Once I'm finished writing the paper, I turn it in and I move on with my life. And that probably worked for a lot of you in previous English classes. It's not going to work as well at this level. At this level, you have to follow at least most of these steps, all three of these major phases. Otherwise, your work is not going to be as good as it could be. It might be okay, but it could always be better if you spend more time on all of our steps, all of our phases. So we'll talk more about drafting and post-writing later. For now, I just want you guys to focus on pre-writing, especially as you get started on your narrative soon. So let me know if you have any questions about that, and all of that info, as usual, can be found in this week's module. And please watch The Simpsons. Some of you might be fans. Even if you're not, check out that video. It is useful. And again, I feel like we can relate to Lisa's experience. A lot of us have sat down and stared at that blank computer screen, that bright white, empty document, and it can be overwhelming. If you don't pre-write, if you don't do idea generation, if you don't have an outline, if you don't know what your purpose is, if you don't know what your thesis is, drafting becomes really hard, just like it is for Lisa. It takes a long time. You get frustrated. You're uncertain. So trust me, you can make your lives easier by pre-writing. And we'll be doing this throughout the semester. So everybody's going to find their own methods, their own ways of doing these steps. There's no one set way. Some of us will like the free write. Some of us might prefer clustering. Some might prefer the journalist questions. Outlines always look different. Everybody's outline will be different. That's great. The schedules will all be different. Everything will look different. This is all very personalized. Find what works best for you. Okay, so I'm going to stop part 1 there, and when we come back for part 2, we'll return to narrative.